Well, welcome everybody. It's really good to have you all here. My name is Lara Smith. I'm the director of the African Studies program, and we're really delighted to have you along with my colleague, Dr. Fida Adeli, director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, associate professor in Clovis and Hala Maqsood Chair in Arab Studies. We want to welcome you to today's event, Sudan's Vital Humanitarian and Political Situation, which is sponsored by the African Studies program, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and the Conflict Resolution Program in the Department of Government. I want to thank all those who helped to coordinate this important event, especially to my colleague Coco Tate. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today, wherever you are, for this vital discussion of Sudan. While the world faces multifaceted crises that demand attention, we also absolutely continue to remain laser focused on our friends and colleagues, the citizens and families who are in Sudan and scattered in the region because of the war there. Today, we have three speakers who will cover a wide breadth of updates about the conflict in Sudan, especially since the event we held last September. You can find the recording of that last event in the chat. I will now briefly introduce each speaker. You can find their full biographies on the event webpage, which is also in the chat. First, I'd like to welcome Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. Abdullahi is a senior advocate for East and Southern Africa at Refugees International. He's an Africa policy expert with over a decade of experience in security, conflict, human rights, refugee work, and strategic communications. Next, we'll have Dr. May Hassan. May is an associate professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the faculty director of MIT Africa. Her first book, Regime Threats and State Solutions, Bureaucratic Loyalty and Embeddedness in Kenya, was selected as a best book of 2020 by Foreign Affairs, among many other accolades. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kholood Khair. Kholood is a Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do think tank based in Khartoum. She's also a radio broadcaster, hosting and producing a weekly radio program, Spotlight 249, that is Sudan's first English language political discussion and debate show aimed at Sudanese youth. The format is that the three speakers will each begin with a short presentation, and then my colleague Fida will ask a few questions. We'll then open it up to discussion to our audience. We're so glad that you're here with us. Please ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, which is found on your screen, or you can also email them to Coco, which is coco.tait@georgetown.edu. If you have any technical issues, also you can email Coco at the same address. This information will be in the chat for you. So with that, I'd like to begin with my colleague, Abdullahi. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Lara, and thank you for the Center for organizing this. I think, the Sudan crisis could easily be defined as, explained really as it's Sudan's past being its prologue, right? I mean, all the things that we are seeing in Sudan right now, whether it is, the humanitarian part that I'll be speaking about, or the conflict part that, my colleagues will be discussing, it's more or less like we are going back in time and trying to unravel what is going on in Sudan. I just want to give you a couple of snapshots just to give you a sense. In 1984, 85, Sudan experienced famine. And if you look at that period also, it's a period that neatly meshes with the conflict in Sudan, largely between the north and the south. During that conflict, 250,000 people died because of famine. If you look at 1998 and 1988, both those famines took place in Bahr al-Ghazal. In one of them, 240,000 people are killed. And I just wanted to say that in terms of the humanitarian reality inside Sudan, and now, with South Sudan not being part of it, the conflict and famine, the reason why they go hand in hand, it's precisely because the Sudanese government is very adept at using food aid to execute the conflict. And in that sense, even the formation of Humanitarian Action Committee that, the Sudan, which is the principal humanitarian agency that interfaces between humanitarian agencies and the state of Sudan, that one was also formed in 1985. That was after the famine that I spoke about. How has then the international, especially the humanitarian agencies, responded to this? One of the principal outcome really, because conflict in Sudan, and as well the outgrowth of the conflict, which is the humanitarian crises, has always been part of this process. But in the past, and like now, before I get into now, is that the international community responded. When the Sudanese authorities, started playing obstruction role through the denial of humanitarian access, the international community formed the Operation Sudan Lifeline. And that was a cross-border and a cross-line delivery of humanitarian aid. Of course, there are problems with OLS. Of course, there are problems of aid manipulation. Of course, there are arguments to be made that, in fact, because of the length, because of failure to adhere some of the agreed protocols, some of the aid were misused. Some of the aid lengthened the crisis, especially the second civil war in Sudan. But that also saved a lot of life. I mean, we forget that, that some of the normative standards around the delivery of humanitarian aid, including system-wide scale-up, including household food economy approach in terms of assessing food aid, were developed during this process. Are there ways in which OLS could have been done differently? Absolutely. Because one of the things, and I would want to use that as a segue to speak about the current reality, is that the delivery of that humanitarian aid for a very long period of time, because the program went for some time, was not done through the local humanitarian groups. And that is something that I think for now, it will be very important, because almost 1 year since the conflict started, very able, under arduous circumstances, Sudanese, mutual aid groups, emergency rooms have been continuing to deliver humanitarian aid. And they've shown that, indeed, localization of humanitarian aid is possible. And if given more support, they can easily scale it up. Just bring it back to the current reality. Even before the conflict erupted mid-April 2023, a third of Sudan was in need of humanitarian aid. That number is now half of Sudanese need humanitarian aid. Close to over 5 million people are in what we call IPC 3 and 4. I just want to explain a little bit about the IPC process, which is an integrated food classification, phase classification. IPC 1 is just minimum, meaning people do have problems, but people can get by. The second phase, which is IPC 2, is food stressed. And the third is food emergency. And the fifth one, which is technically the famine situation, is where we speak about catastrophe. Right now, as we speak, there are some parts of Sudan that are, for all intent and purposes, because I don't want to bore you with how the food classification process is done, because we don't have an IPC office in Sudan. Most of it is done from Kenya. Most of it is they're using surveys, and they're using old historical data in farming situation. And what the really sad part about this is, you're having Sudan, probably one of the food-rich country in terms of agriculture, and you have adequate supply of fresh water. You're having a country now having the distinct possibility of having both famine and genocide going on in some parts of the country, right? And the reason why I said, the Sudan's past is its prologue, 20 years ago in Darfur, the whole world came together and said that, what is going on is genocide. At the same site, using the same actors, we are experiencing the same. But the movement in terms of addressing some of this, including the delivery of humanitarian aid in 2024, under no circumstance, people should not be facing famine. Famine is unconscionable. Famine is not a function of lack of food. Famine is not a function of, poor weather condition, because humanitarian aid communities, they know how to deliver the last mile delivery of humanitarian aid. you know, I mean, like we speak about World Food Program. You know, to my mind, it's a humanitarian organization for all intent and purposes. World Food Program is also a large, you know, shipping and logistic company, if you will, because they know the shipping routes, they know the delivery of how this can be done. And again, like I said, Operation Lifeline Sudan demonstrated that, you know, they can deliver. The idea that, you know, the Sudan Armed Forces, I think a couple of days ago, said that, no, yeah, we can allow, you know, the delivery of humanitarian aid across the border via Chad, as if it has control, you know, adequate control of that, is to, at the face of it, just an army that is trying to show that they will be able, they are still in charge, when in reality it's not. I want to say two things before I hand it over. One is the question of manipulation and instrumentalization of humanitarian aid inside Sudan. I think, you know, Humanitarian Action Committee of Sudan is very good at doing this. And right now, you know, I mean, like traditionally, the way some of these conflicts will end is really, you know, the cessation of hostilities and impeded delivery of humanitarian aid, and then finally accountability. And those are the three buckets. And, you know, they need to go hand in hand. Without adequate, you know, cessation of hostilities, the delivery of humanitarian aid then becomes nearly impossible. Collection of evidence that reaches such a certain threshold becomes very, very difficult to achieve. So these have to go hand in hand. But the Sudan authorities are very adept at using food aid, largely limiting the access. Here, really, it's not just attacking the humanitarian convoy, looting humanitarian aid agencies' facilities, including their warehouses. It is also not giving permits for people to move around across. Right now, because of the way the regions where most of the two primary belligerents and their supporters hold, it is very difficult to do a cross line. You know, I mean, like the military largely on the side of Port Sudan, where large-scale aid and other goods come through, they control that. So to transfer the aid across one part of the country is incredibly very difficult. RSF, of course, they get some of their, you know, ammunitions through Chad, and they control that part. And I'm using the word control, you know, very liberally, because it's not control in the way that we know of. So as such, the belligerent parties know that they can hold the citizen hostage so that humanitarian group can come and deliver humanitarian, because this is something that they have known. They know how to do it. They can slow down. The final point that I really wanted to speak is the role of third-party actors outside Sudan. And in this case, I think the UAE focus will be very important. Just for a second, UAE largely supports the RSF. And as a result, without the RSF, without their support, I think it would be very difficult for RSF to continue executing the war in the way it's doing. It's not just the military support that they give them, it is also the political cover that it gets from the UAE. As a result, it becomes very difficult. As long as RSF is not made a toxic asset to the RSF, to the UAE, I think we will be having a lot of problems, a lot of the problems that we are seeing about, you know, cessation of hostilities agreements that are agreed in Jeddah, that are agreed in Nairobi, that are agreed via IGAD. All those will be very, very difficult. And that's why I'll end by saying that, you know, a lot of people get frustrated that, look, in 20 years ago, during Sudan genocide, Darfur genocide, there were a lot of mobilization. The reason is now there are many actors that really have an outsized influence, including the Gulf countries, including Turkey, including Iran now. And we are seeing some of its outcome in the way the battlefields are unfolding. I think this is what happened in Ethiopia a couple of years ago when, you know, the Tigrayans were almost taking over the capital. The drones provided by the UAE really turned the tide of that conflict. Iran, I mean, over the last couple of days, we've had, you know, the battlefield fortune of the Sudan army that was flagging for some time really now getting a little bit better in certain places and still very early days. And that, I think some of the analysts are attributing it to the support that the army has gotten from Iran. So I'll stop at that. I know I've touched on a couple of issues, but I want to leave more room for Q&A. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi, for that, really excellent overview and some important points that I know we'll want to discuss more. I did some introductions as we got started, May, so your bio has already been read. So can we turn it over to you? Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being at this event. Not much light is being currently shown on the situation in Sudan, if we can even call it a situation. That seems like, whitewashing it a bit. And so I'm really grateful for Georgetown for putting together this event, and also for everyone in the audience who's here to attend. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the historical context of this conflict and how it emerged, where it emerged, talk about the two belligerents before Kholood starts talking about thinking about where it's going to go from here. And so, as Abdullah, discussed in his opening comments, the current war is between two arms of Sudan's internal security apparatus. We have the army on one side, as headed by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF as headed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's popularly known as Hemeti. These two agencies, the army and the Sudan Armed Forces more generally, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, have a long history between them, and a long history that's completely tangled up with the former authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, who came to power in 1989 amid a military Islamist coup. Omar al-Bashir, when he came to power, he was a lieutenant brigadier within the army when he came in, but in part because of his own ascension to the throne by the military. And because of Sudan's history of attempted and successful military coups going back to independence, al-Bashir engaged in a policy that in political science we would call coup-proofing the security forces when he came to power. What's that mean? It's a common tactic employed by military dictators whereby they create parallel institutions. They fundamentally fragment the security apparatus. Instead of letting it be unitary and being more effective, they fragment the security apparatus, creating different counterweights within the security apparatus to traditional security agencies, with the idea that it makes it harder for any one specific agency to execute a successful coup against the leader. The idea being, if any one agency decides to mount a coup against the autocrat in power, the autocrat can call upon another branch of the security apparatus to serve as a counterweight, to use their guns, their munitions, their personnel to stop that coup that's being executed. This is precisely what Bashir did, especially with regards to the creation of the RSF. As a bit of background, Sudan has, since independence before independence, has had a long history of civil conflict in peripheral zones outside of the center. And across Sudan's many leaders, including some democratic ones, presidents have given some local groups guns, arms, to fight on the center's behalf. For some reasons, in some contexts, this was quite practical. Sudan's very, very, especially before the secession of the South, was a very large country, about the third of the size of the U.S. And so, getting personnel down to, or like in areas where the center, to where these conflicts happen is very difficult. At the same time, this did have a strategic component. And Bashir took this strategy of having local groups fight on behalf of the center, took it one step further. This starts around the 1990s when Bashir's regime, there was an internal split with Hassan al-Turabi and fighting an internal rebellion, if you can even call it that, in Western Sudan and Darfur. Many people were rebelling against the government for many reasons in Darfur. And while one rational response, in a sense, to stop a rebellion in the country would have been to empower the army to fight this war, Bashir was really conscious and he was really wary of the consequences of doing so. The idea of giving this large organization, giving the SAF that has historically launched coups in the past, giving them battle experience, giving them better equipment, giving them prestige and legitimacy from carrying out this war, what would that mean down the line? And so, like his predecessors, Bashir outsourced fighting in this area, or in the periphery in general, to local Arab tribes in the region. These morphed into what are known as the Janjaweed, local Arab tribes who ended up terrorizing, committing a genocide against local populations that were rebelling against the center. Fast forward 10 or 15 years later, Bashir ended up institutionalizing this force. This is separate than what, and this is what I mean by Bashir going a step further than his predecessors. Whereas other leaders had simply just used local militias to fight peripheral battles, Bashir actually institutionalized the Janjaweed. He institutionalized it through eventually by 2017, a near unanimous act of parliament, giving them almost equal institutional and formal footing in the country in the security apparatus, like org chart, as the army, but put it in a separate branch of the security apparatus. The idea being that this force is becoming a counterweight. And in actuality, it was a counterweight not just on the org chart of Sudan's security apparatus, but financially. The leader of the RSF by this time, the leader of the RSF, Hameti, was given a huge gold mine in the west of the country, Sudan's most productive gold mine. So giving pretty much Hameti access directly into the state's resources that he could do whatever it is that he wanted. Militarily, helping out the RSF, making these soldiers battle ready, both in Sudan, but also by allowing Hameti to, in a sense, sell mercenary services of RSF officers to the war in Yemen. And so even though the army is a much bigger force, creating this counterweight to the army in other ways, especially financially, militarily, and allowing Hameti to have more sway on the international scene. And so then throughout the 2010s, what we're seeing is the RSF and the army really counterbalancing each other. And this, in a sense, Bashir, especially by the 2010s when the economy was not really doing so great, when Bashir was really losing popularity, Bashir being able to hang on to power because the security apparatus as a whole was quite fragmented. There were these parallel institutions that were pitted against each other. But as I alluded to, that all changed in the midst of Sudan's sustained economic crisis. Ever since the secession of the south of Sudan, where much of the oil reserves of the country were located in 2011, Sudan entered a really deep recession, if you can even call it that. And inflation rates kept going up and up and up, beginning in 2011, with rates in 2018, the year before, the year of the actual uprising started hitting 50 or 60%. And so it's in this broader context that, this economic context, that spontaneous protests emerged across the country in December of 2018. Though the protests emerged spontaneously, the protests in part quickly grew because the formal political opposition, here I think the independent labor unions, think of the opposition political parties, so alongside really important women and youth groups, all of them came together under the umbrella entity that Forces Freedom and Change, or the FFC, and they began organizing protests together. Now, of course, the protests got very violent as different branches of the security apparatus were tasked with putting them down. Autocrats generally don't like popular uprisings against their rule. But for the most part, citizens were able to avoid officers, and mobilization continued, particularly in the capital megacity of Khartoum, which at this point had anywhere of between like 8 and 10 million people. Though I will note, I've done a lot of interviews around to this uprising with protesters and dissidents from that period, and it was really clear that while all officers from across the security apparatus are quite violent and rained death and destruction against innocent civilians. It seemed as though my respondents were really wary, or talked about the extra, or like the particular violence that the RSF reigned, that they were particularly brutal, that this was a force that was battle hardened, that they knew how to deal with insurgency. And whereas the other arms of the security apparatus tended to have social bonds with locals, within Khartoum especially, social bonds that inhibited officers from engaging in like the most excessive forms of violence, that really wasn't the case with the RSF, who tended to be recruited from these Arab tribes of Western Darfur, or in some cases actually related tribes from across the Sahel region of Africa. They were much less embedded in Khartoum society. Going back to the protests, they kept on going and going until they cascaded in April of 2019. I'll note that the protest in which they cascaded was on April 6th. It was the 34th anniversary of the last popular uprising. And I want to talk about how these protests cascaded, because I think it's really poignant about the role of the SAF versus RSF. And talking to FFC officials about this protest, they had decided that, they saw that the protest movement was movement was waning. So they're like, okay, let's try to have one last big protest. Some organizers were like, we were hoping for 10,000 people to see if people would respond, and, just let's end on a good note at least. And so they asked people to march towards the Army General Command. And the idea was to have like 10,000 people strong in front of the army saying, with, their brothers and sisters in arms in front of them saying like, are you going to protect our country, army, military, or are you instead going to use your services to protect Bashir? Notably, this was not to the RSF headquarters. This was to the army. But to everyone's surprise, these protests ended up being much, much larger. This protest by some accounts was like 500,000, 800,000 people. And then right after that protest, there was an impromptu sit-in for the next 5 days in front of the military headquarters. And with such a significant outpouring of support in favor of the protest movement and against Bashir, it became the armed forces, even though they were fragmented, even though they were Bashir had engineered them to be pitted against each other, it became increasingly difficult for them to use their authority to not oust Bashir. We don't know the specifics of what happened during the period when the sit-in started, while Bashir was still in power. But we do have a sense that Bashir apparently ordered Hemeti and other agencies to violently put down the sit-in. But it seems as though this revolutionary cascade was big enough. And by April 11th, the story goes that Hemeti went and spoke personally to Bashir and said, the leaders of all the different security apparatuses have decided to coup you out, in a sense, to make you step down. And that's what happened, that the security agencies, despite Bashir having tried to fragment them for years upon end, the civilian protests and the FFC being strong enough to make these agencies work together on behalf of the protest movement. I'll note that this date, April 11th, is really important, not only because it ended Bashir's regime, but in a sense, it starts the beginning of the transition period by the RSF and SAF working together in opposition to the civilian FFC. So after this protest movement, the FFC was supposed to, help shepherd the transition period of 3 years to create the conditions and like the institutional landscape for elections and democracy to return the country. But overall, during the transition period, as it continued, you got, observers, Sudanese alike, we recognize that it was a really, really uneasy alliance between the FFC, between the RSF and the army. On the one hand, civilians, and talking to a lot of civilian leaders, they recognized that they didn't actually have that much hard power. They didn't have too much support from the RSF. They didn't have too much support from SAF. And so even though they had the support of the street, which was really important, and, by many accounts, they should have utilized a lot more, the legitimacy that they gained, they felt as though they were negotiating between a rock and a hard place because they fundamentally didn't have the guns. On the army side, we have the SAF, an agency that was infiltrated by Islamists, many of the same Islamists that Bashir and his coterie had instilled from, back in 1989 when he came to power. Many who were very wary or very much trying to plot against the civilian FFC, and clearly didn't want to return to democratic rule. And on the third side, we have the RSF that, for its own reasons, wasn't excited about democratic rule, in part because of all of the demands for transitional justice by the civilian by civilian leaders. One of the calls during the revolution was justice, in part for all of the crimes that the armed forces, including the RSF, had carried out under Bashir. This uneasy alliance continued throughout 2019, throughout 2020, and then by 2021, a really important date is October 25th, when there was an autogolup, when Burhan, who was leading the transition, was ostensibly supposed to hand over power to his civilian counterpart by the tail end of 2021. Decided he didn't really want to do that, and he and Hemeti joined forces once again to sideline the civilian FFC and derail the transition. There was a civilian cabinet that continued after this autogolup, but it was a largely ceremonial role, and everyone really understood that real power rested within the military complex between Burhan and Hemeti. And I really want to stress this state because whereas before it was an uneasy trio between SAF, RSF, and FFC, with the FFC sidelined, RSF and SAF were very much going head to head. And in talking to a lot of policy experts on Sudan, and people who were watching the elite politics of the country, people were just talking about the extent to which, now that there's no other distraction, the tension between these two military agencies was going to come to a head. And that's eventually what we saw with the outbreak of the war. One of the key sticking issue that ended up leading to the start of the war was, alongside how to deal with transitional justice, was how should Sudan integrate, unify the security apparatus. Policy experts and Sudanese themselves recognizing that having this fragmented security apparatus was not good for the country's democratic or financial health. And so how do we bring this RSF into SAF? And the ultimate sticking point was that whereas SAF and Burhan were advocating for let's do this quick, let's get this done tomorrow, let's integrate RSF now, Hemeti and the RSF were like, no, let's think about a 10-year process. How is it, and thinking strategically, Hemeti not willing to let go of his control over this empire and these officers that have deep loyalty to him. And so it's within this context, and as negotiations continued about how to frame the transition process, the sticking point of how do we integrate these two forces together finally came to a head in April of 2023, when fighting broke out between them. When whether it was a purge by the SAF trying to quickly purge the RSF, or the RSF trying to launch a preemptive coup on the SAF, but the general idea being that integration was, the clock towards integration was dwindling down, and that's really what was the spark that launched this war. So I'll stop there and let Kholood talk about more current dynamics.
Thank you so much, May. That was an amazing. It's a lot of history to do in a short time. So we're super grateful for that. I learned a lot. Kholood, it's really nice to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. I did do some introductions at the beginning, so folks have seen your bio. So we'll let you just get started right away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Hello, everyone. Excuse me, I'm a bit unwell, so hopefully I'll be clear. I think it's a good place to pick up from where May left off. What we have seen just in the past 11 months, it's not even a year yet, is the level of destruction I think few of us could have predicted. And that's because the infrastructure in the country, the service delivery in the country, everything that was holding up, the state was holding up, communities, was already endangered by the coup. So by the time the war came, all of these state institutions, all of these parts of the community, whether it's banking or markets or supply chains, all of that, clinics, education, hospitals, schools, all of that was very, very fragile. And the war was able to demolish so much of it so quickly. So if you think of, for example, education, you have 19 million children out of the 23 million children of Sudan out of school right now. Those are the kinds of numbers and the kinds of proportions we have never seen before. So even though this war could be thought of very much as an accumulation of Sudan's previous wars, and bearing in mind Sudan has never had a year of peace since its independence, it's both an accumulation of those old wars and also an entirely new and unprecedented situation. Partly because it is the state, it is the center of the state in the capital Khartoum that has been hit first, and for the first time really since Sudan's independence, and in many ways hit hardest. And the battle right now that we see going on as we speak for areas of Khartoum just signifies how symbolically important it is for both the Sudanese armed forces and for the rapid support forces in terms of their being able to make claims on the state. And what this means is that we will continue to see this war of attrition playing out. Not so many months ago, the RSF was on the ascendancy, and everyone thought that Hemedti's trip in the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa region was sort of a victory lap. And then only in the first few months of this year, we're seeing the Sudanese armed forces also win some military campaigns. And we're seeing the requisite attention from different civilian actors who would align themselves with one belligerent or the other. But obviously, there's going to be this ebb and flow. Today it's SAF that's on the rise and gaining territory. We're expecting a counterattack from the RSF, and so they will probably also be winning some campaigns at some stage. And that's because, as May alluded to earlier, these are both two parts of the same security services. They both have their own different abilities to or advantages over the other. For example, the Sudanese armed forces has aerial bombardment as an advantage that the RSF does not currently have. The RSF has a better infantry, well-trained, better resourced infantry than the Sudanese armed forces has. And so because they're both two parts of the same security force, it's unlikely that any one of them would be able to have enough of a military advantage to be able to have an outright military victory. And that's because also, bears out sort of historically speaking, in all the wars that Sudan has had, whether they are, sort of smaller conflicts or the larger civil wars, the First Sudanese Civil War, Second Sudanese Civil War, the Darfur conflict, all of them have never been settled militarily. They've always been settled, if you will, through some kind of political or peace agreement. That is the history in Sudan. And it's unlikely that this would follow a different trajectory per se. The other horrible lesson from history is not just that there's a propensity of sort of state violence and wars of this nature, but also that they tend to last an extremely long time. So if we look at this First Sudanese Civil War, that lasted about 17, 18 years. The Second Sudanese Civil War, 22 years. The Darfur conflict, 20 years and counting. And so we are potentially now also looking down the barrel of an average 20-year conflict. Now, if we're looking at, because of the way that this conflict has impacted the capital, and therefore banking services, services from public services, etc., decision-making from different levels of government. If we're seeing all of that dwindle and deteriorate just in the first year, what will things look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time? One of the ways in which this war is different is not just that it has impacted Khartoum and other areas that have never been touched by this type of violence, but that it's also it's wholesale. It has really touched every single part of Sudanese political, economic, and social life. There is no one in the country that has not been either directly or indirectly impacted by this war. Previously, successive governments in the country, whether they're autocratic regimes or the very few, one or two democratic governments that we've had, they've all been able to inoculate the center against state violence. And they've always been able to protect Khartoum, but also places like Gadarif and Jazeera, the agricultural heartlands of the country, against the impact of war. So the North-South civil wars, both 1 and 2, were fought predominantly in the south. The Darfur conflict was fought in Darfur, even though the central government, if you will, or the Central Sudanese Armed Forces were a key belligerent in that. Similarly, in the east, the war was fought in the east, never came to Khartoum unless through the refugee flows that would come into the capital for refuge. That is completely gone now. In a way, what this sets up post-war is that it's something of a social equalizer. As as horrible as it is to have so many people, such a large proportion of people in the country experience war, and also the impacts of war, such as a lack of access to resources, in particular famine, which we are seeing signs of right now. At the same time, it's very difficult for people to turn the other cheek effectively and say, and buy into any kind of centralized propaganda about what's happening in the war. Everyone knows what this war, everyone has felt what this war is about, even if there's still disagreements within the public discourse about what caused it and who the main belligerents are. I think that we've crossed the Rubicon in many ways. There's no really going back from that, because everyone now understands the horrors of living through this conflict. There is some hope that there would then be a sense that none of us would want this to happen again. Now that we've all got a sense of what this looks and feels like, that it's something we would all want to, ensure, guard against, ensure that it doesn't happen. The unfortunate thing is that because this war is really being fought on 3 fronts, the battlefield, the info war and the information space, particularly on social media, and thirdly, the mediation space, and focusing here particularly on the middle one, which is the PR info war. Because of that, there is a tendency to split the public debate and polarize the public debate between those who back the Sudanese armed forces and see that the RSF has no future in Sudan, and those who back the RSF and say that SAF has spent too long destroying the Sudanese state, and in addition to the Islamists, and that there is no future for them. Now, none of those camps are effectively going to get what they want, because the likelihood is, and as we speak, there are several drafts of mediated settlements on the table. As we speak, there are plans to ensure that both the SAF and the RSF remain in power to some degree. Now, will they be phased out through successive years or through successive phases of a potential peace agreement? Potentially. But what will replace them? What kind of civilian coalition could replace them? And when will that all take shape? Is this something that can be feasibly done now? History says no. The messaging from the belligerent camps, particularly the Sudanese armed forces, says no. But there are a lot of different sort of attempts at ensuring that at least some mediation options are on the table. But I think before we even get to a credible mediation, which would require the international community to get together rather than having, for example, mediations in Manama, Bahrain, and mediations in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, mediations led by President Assisi in Cairo, mediations led by IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority in Development, the regional economic grouping, or led, for example, by the African Union, that all of these would come together and lead a mediation. We're not there yet. But even if they did come together and put something on the table that was built on consensus to end the war, We don't have consensus on the international community to end the war. We don't have consensus on domestic communities to end the war, not yet. And then secondly, the international community had put together their incentive structures and more importantly, the disincentive structures for continuing the war. And then we move towards mediation. Even if all of that took place, it won't take place very soon. And the danger is that by the time the international community has fully reckoned with what is going to happen, not just to Sudan, but also the region, and here I'm talking about the Horn of Africa region, already very much destabilized by what's going on in Ethiopia, but also between Ethiopia and Somalia potentially, etc. And the Red Sea region, of course, that we know is already has been destabilized in the past few months, and with very little sort of resolution in sight. Even if that's the case, we won't, I think, have the same conflict dynamics that we see today by the time the international community and local domestic actors have really sort of understood what is at stake. What do I mean by that? As we speak, we have seen fragmentations, vast fragmentations in and command and control issues within both the SAF camp and the RSF camp, but to different degrees. So we are seeing right now, for example, as the RSF is planning to retake parts of Umdurman and other parts of, and shore up its territory in Jazeera, it is having problems with some of its ill-disciplined militias. We are seeing that the ethnic militias that it has relied on, that it has recruited to be part of its army, effectively, are also not necessarily getting on well with each other. So you have famously the Bani Halba and the Salamat ethnic groups, both loyal to the RSF in various ways, argue amongst themselves, and the RSF was unable to fully reckon with how to deal with and address those internal issues. We also have issues between the Rizagat group, which Hemeti comes from, the broader group, and some of the Miseria group in South Kordofan, and that's related to pay, it's related to positions, it's a lot of infighting, and the RSF has not shown that it is a mature enough organization, if you will, that can handle these types of internal rifts. There's also the fact that in the places that they have taken over, for example, the 4 out of 5 states in Darfur, in Jazeera and parts of Khartoum, the city, we haven't seen any governance plan that, for example, would institute some kind of rule of law, that would have some kind of services being provided to people. So it's effectively a reign of terror, and they haven't been able to sell themselves as a political entity in the way that they had hoped. What this might lead to is different warlords within the RSF ranks would be created that would then vie for different sorts of political settlements separately, and sometimes in contradiction to the RSF. So we're looking at getting a massive fragmentation in those camps. Similarly, in SAF, it's less a question of fragmentation, but there are certainly internal divisions within SAF, and we saw that very clearly when SAF wasn't doing well militarily towards the end, basically from April, when the war started, towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And through that time, we saw, sometimes very public disgruntlement within the armed forces. Senior members of the armed forces are either being asked to leave, forced into retirement, or leaving altogether. We saw a reliance on by SAF on Islamist militias, something they've always relied upon because they never had much of an infantry. And because of that, you're creating, again, this mosaic of different actors with different outcomes and different objectives that will also could see sites of splitting or fragmentation, or at least, at the very least, divisions. The difficulty there is that now, for example, let's say the Jeddah format, which may be restarted pretty soon. There you call for 2 different belligerent groups. You call for the SAF camp and the RSF camp, and that's only 2, and it's difficult enough getting some kind of agreement between just 2 belligerents. If we see this fragmentation take place, fragmentation is very, very common in the Sudanese political landscape amongst both the military actors and also, and especially, civilian actors. But if we see that, we might soon be dealing with 4, 5, 6, 10, who knows how many different belligerents, trying to get them all on the same page. So time is clearly of the essence. You know, the longer you wait on this, the more difficult it will be to wrangle the different political interests in the country. And of course, as Abdullahi alluded to, the different regional, international interests that are also starting to either pick a side or hedge. In other words, support both sides in varying and different ways, and also in unpredictable ways. And just before I end, I think it's important to say that we have to balance out several different impulses here. The impulse to act urgently, which is that with the famine already at our doorstep, it's not enough to rely on humanitarian aid for a famine. We need to safeguard the next harvest, and that requires at least a setting up of humanitarian zones, if not an end to the war entirely. And we need to safeguard that with investing in civilian entities that can actually represent people in the long term, and it will take time to bring together, because it's very clear that all the civilian entities that are coalescing right now are not really meeting the demands of many of Sudan's civilians. And that organically, any attempts to really get some bona fide civilian representation is going to take some time. So I think what this means is that we can't just be lazy, effectively, about how we read this conflict. And this adds to the complexity of it and the complexity of resolving it. Is that we have to look for the opportunities where they are. We have to make the investments when we can, but we also have to make sure that the right kinds of clear-eyed thinking really around what is causing the different issues within this broader conflict and how to engage with it. I'll just end on something to pick up on what May said, which is that, you know, impunity, avoiding transitional justice, deferring transitional justice, that is at the heart of why we are where we are. The reason that both SAF and the RSF feel that they can prosecute this war in this really, really violent way, with, for example, the RSF committing acts of genocide, the Sudanese armed forces committing indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, including schools and hospitals, etc. The reason they feel they can do that is because they've never been held to account before. Therefore, the resolution to this war, not just ending the fighting, but ending the war itself, will have to grapple with the issue of transitional justice. We'll have to put forward the kinds of transitional justice structures, whether they're domestic or international or hybrid, and really try and create a certainty, a recompense for civilians, but a certainty for the perpetrators, to ensure that they don't just put the guns down for the time being and then pick them back up later on down the line. That's been something that historically Sudanese political and peace agreements have never been good at. And it's in many ways what has led us to where we are. And so we have to grapple with that. It has to be central to our thinking about how we end this conflict, not just a nice to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. I know that I've seen all of your names on many panels over the past year. And I want to thank you all for making the time to speak to our audience today, and to continue to speak and remind us and keep Sudan kind of try to keep Sudan at the center of our attention. So I just want to say that, because I've met none of you before, but I've seen all of you out there constantly over the last few months. So I just want to start by acknowledging that. And we have some questions in the Q&A. I have a couple of questions, which maybe I'll start us off with, and I'll encourage folks to continue to put their questions in the Q&A. Maybe just picking up, Kholood, because this was a question I was thinking about after May's presentation, where you left off talking about cultivating the kinds of civilian organizations, institutions that are needed. And I wonder if you could say a bit more for the audience who probably have varying degrees of background, right? Who the civilian actors are right now who are at the table, their relationship to the FFC. So May, you brought us up to this point of the FFC and talked about their relative weakness vis-a-vis armed parties. So I'm just wondering right now, how would you characterize kind of who is at the table in terms representing civilians or the civil society in Sudan? Both Kholood and May, if you could speak to that, that would be great. Yeah.
I'm happy to go first, May. So first things first, we have a tendency in Sudan to call people who aren't civilians. And not only is it extremely inaccurate, I think it also allows other armed actors, for example, rebels that signed the peace agreement and haven't demilitarized, to be able to fashion themselves into civilian entities, where actually in many ways, they stopped really representing any kind of constituency a long time ago. But just to say that some of the people that May and I may be mentioning aren't actually civilians per se, and are actually heads of military or armed groups. But the biggest one, I guess, that people would be most familiar with is the Taqaddum entity. It's a platform, it's set up as a platform in October of last year, bringing together the FFC that May mentioned, which was the sort of main civilian bloc during the transitional period, and also a group called the Declaration of Principles Group, which had, unionists and had professionals and different sorts of stakeholders within it. So you have some more of a sort of political entity and less of a political entity coming together to form this platform, which is meant to be inclusive and bring in different actors within the civilian space to come and have a conversation about what the next transition in Sudan looks like. Now, obviously, that conversation can be thought of very much as quite premature, but the point of Taqaddum is at least to do the groundwork of bringing in these different and disparate civilian groups, at least on a consensus around that the war should end, and as the sort of trying to figure out how to incentivize the different belligerent groups, not just the SAF and the RSF, but other groups, on how to, reach this resolution. Now, this group is led by former Prime Minister Abdullahi, who, let's say, has mixed reviews among Sudanese people. Some people see him as the only political leader in the past 30 years that could be, to some degree, could bring about some of the democratic and civilian outcomes that Sudan has seen. Others see him as a weak bureaucrat who was unprepared for the role of politician, but is, has a sort of very affable, avuncular attitude that makes him quite, different to the strong men in uniform that they see, sort of a bit of a breath of fresh air. And others think that actually, he started off well, but then he signed an agreement after the coup with the junta and sort of never really recovered from that politically. But I think the problem is that in Sudan, we don't really have politicians. We have political celebrities. And what I mean by that is that, and we also have political entrepreneurs. I think political entrepreneurs is pretty simple. You have political leaders who sort of try and figure out how best to maximize on any position that they have in order to get in power or get back into power. But we also have political celebrities, which is that you will know them by name, but you won't necessarily know what they stand for. And it's very difficult sometimes to break down what different political leaders in Sudan actually think in terms of policy areas, in terms of ideologies, in terms of, any kind of political or policy program they might want to implement. And so that, I think, is universal. And we also, within that framework, see, for example, different groupings. Like recently we saw the head of the SPLM and Agar faction, who is effectively Burhan's number 2 in the pro-SAF camp, the Port Sudan regime. And he recently made a sort of very quickly cobbled together pact between different actors, some of them armed, some of them not, really to make use of the military victories that SAF has had. So very much within that political entrepreneur characterization. And then you also have just, very well-established political parties, bearing in mind Sudan has some of the most, the longest and most well-established political parties in Africa and the Arab world. And you have some of those parties coming together. For example, recently there was a joint statement between a sort of sectarian party, the Communist Party, and the Ba'ath Party. I think Sudan is probably the only country that still has a Ba'ath Party. But the point is, you have these sort of relics. I tend to think of them as such. And they are still striving to be relevant. Now, is there room for all of these actors? Sure. Is plurality a good thing? Certainly. But I think unless they are able to articulate very well what it is they stand for now, and what it is they are willing to do in the future in terms of providing for the public good, I can't foresee that they would have much traction with a large majority of Sudanese people. I'm going to leave it to May to let us know what she thinks.
Thanks, Kholood, for that answer. I only have a few things to add. And I really appreciated the point that Kholood made about who are these civilians? In a sense, are they actually representing the population? To what extent are they, like, in a sense, political celebrities who are completely unmoored, untethered from the population? So traditionally, we might think that political elites have their position in society and are able to negotiate, have this power to negotiate with authoritarian leaders, not because they own all of these guns and can muster that hard power behind them, but instead because they have the power of the street, because they have the popular support behind them. But the question is, do a lot of these leaders in Sudanese elite society, do they actually have popular support? I think the answer oftentimes is no. Maybe they represent a little bit of Khartoum elite society, but for the most part, and this isn't their fault, but thinking more historically, the Bashir regime was in power for 30 years. That's a long time. And they recognized the role that opposition parties, that labor unions, that formal civil society groups had in the past used to bring about the downfall of authoritarian regimes. So Bashir, like a smart man, spent much of his time in office trying to break the bonds between civilian leadership and the population. And so this just goes back to the question of, to what extent did these civilian leaders actually represent society? I think this is important because in recognizing who it is that's actually negotiating with the SAF and who's actually invited to the negotiating table, it's unclear the extent to which they can represent Sudanese society. And probably just as importantly, the degree to which SAF and RSF think that they are a legitimate counterweight that deserve to be acknowledged and deserve to be taken into account in these negotiations. In thinking about, the question of who should be invited instead, I think this is a really hard question in that, and comparatively thinking about Sudan's civil society with regards to some of its neighbors, it's quite underdeveloped precisely because of this long-lasting dictatorship. I should say that the formal political arena is quite underdeveloped. Obviously, there's strong bonds in the informal society and informal civil society and informal organizations, but there's not too many mechanisms by which it's easy to just incorporate leaders within unaffiliated or informal civil society into these negotiations. That's something that we've seen over and over again throughout many of these negotiations. I don't know what the next step might be. Is it like inviting a lot more local tribal leaders? Is it inviting a lot of the leaders of local resistance committees now who are serving as the state, who are providing the much needed humanitarian aid that international organizations and the Sudanese state are not providing? I'm not sure, but in thinking about who actually is at the negotiating table, I think we should just, as Kholood suggested, like really think about the extent to which they have real popular support behind.
Thank you. So I have one more question before I turn to the Q&A, and this is for Abdullahi. Abdullahi, you talked about kind of the local aid and localizing aid and the kind of efficacy of local mutual aid groups. And I wonder if you could speak to, given the broader context that you described, right, the ways in which aid is being politicized and manipulated by the parties to this conflict, right? Is there still space? Like, what is the space available to these local aid groups? Is aid getting to them? And, are international aid organizations kind of like willing to pursue that angle? And what space is there even to do that, given the broader context that you painted? Yeah.
I mean, you're touching on something that is very, very it's very germane to the extent that we sometimes think as, of aid industry as, this good faith effort, and we are all just doing it for the love of the job and all that kind of stuff. Also, it's a political it's a power. There's a lot of power that aid groups have, right? And that power sometimes is not necessarily benign. So to the extent that they are delegating some of these powers to some of these groups, I think it's not the worst thing. But are they going to do, like you said, most likely not on their own volition? But there are precedents here. Really, I want to speak about, the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, where, aid groups agreed during the Grand Bargain that 25% of aid in those countries will go to the local groups, right? And that is something that we are seeing being implemented in some areas, but for majority of that pledge is not being done. But I think just if you look at Ukraine now, most of the aid actually is done through the local Ukrainian groups. And secondly, more importantly, in this case, the arguments that are advanced for why these local groups should not be in the delivery of the humanitarian aid, all of them are falling by their waysides, right? For instance, it's very difficult to establish the due diligence. I mean, the groups have demonstrated that, look, this is the amount of money that was given. We can actually account for every cent. And furthermore, the value for money, if you give them 10 million and give another, big humanitarian group that has got all this technical support, but also have a tremendous amount of overhead costs, the value for money, because I mean, the way the aid works is there's a lot of value chain from where the money comes, the vendors and the people who are being paid. But for these folks, as long as the telecom holds, it is not very difficult in terms of delivering. Here, it's largely food, you talk about food aid, but it's cash transfer because it's efficient. It is also, like people waiting for food aid, it's a little bit dehumanizing versus when it's sent discrete to, specific numbers and people can go and buy what they want. It's not what you say, you only need X, Y, and Z. But I think for the humanitarian group, this is really a true test of their commitment to the delivery of humanitarian aid with a local characteristic, right? And as, Kholood alluded to, we are at the very early stages of this conflict. And if the conflict continues, humanitarian groups, the large professional humanitarian groups, will not be able to deliver this aid. Then the burden falls on these, small groups. They need to be supported. I just wanted to use this opportunity also just to speak about something that Kholood spoke about. Khartoum being now the center of gravity of this conflict. It has all the political and, implications that she mentioned, but it also has a serious humanitarian implication because a lot of, processing plants for most of the food aid, the transportation corridor, not just for Khartoum, and this is why the conflict in Sudan, but now particularly hitting Khartoum is very difficult, is that Khartoum is the hub, whether it's, to Chad or to South Sudan in terms of delivery. And also some of the, transportation corridor is on the same, and that makes it very, very difficult. Finally, I'll end by the question around food insecurity and famine. Really, when you start thinking about it, it is, yes, the lack of food aid becomes the primary driver. The real danger is the secondary impacts, meaning if you look at Sudan, 70% of health centers have been destroyed. That means if people are injured in battle or they had food insecurity problems or kids have malnutrition, it becomes really difficult, right? So I think, when, water facilities have been destroyed, waterborne illnesses then become very, very easy and wipes, communities. And you have something like, according to UNICEF, 700,000 people, 700,000 children already malnourished. I want to put a caveat on all these numbers. I've thrown around some of these numbers. Not most of these numbers are an undercount. So even when we say that this number of people need aid, this number of people are malnourished, it is an extreme undercount. In fact, it is one of those conflicts that we really are very, very short-handed in terms of the accurate data. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Lara, do you have any questions or should I? go to the Q&A?
We can go to the Q&A. I have many, but I'll find them later. There's so many in the Q&A in the box.
Okay. Okay, so one of the first questions is can someone speak to the current situation in the Nuba Mountains? Anyone who'd like to take that, or?
Yes, for that I can.
Okay.
So I think it's really important that was mentioned, because oftentimes, because parts of the Nuba Mountains have been under sort of an autonomous region, effectively under the SPLM and Al-Hilo faction, they're often sort of left out of considerations around this war. And in terms of the humanitarian delivery, it's very difficult to do cross-area humanitarian delivery from sort of government of Sudan previously controlled areas into these SPLM areas, which are also called the liberated areas by the SPLM. And so often a lot of the aid that does come in is through South Sudan. So you have a sort of crossing of an international border and a lot of different intricacies, related to that. What the sort of ground level, grassroots humanitarian actors, local humanitarian actors and volunteers and civil society organizations in the Nuba Mountains have done for over a decade now is institute what we have started to see in other parts of the country, which is a much more localized approach to aid. Which means that it is not, the big sort of alphabet soup of UN agencies or INGOs that are delivering the aid. It is actually local actors who are doing that. And doing that means that they're able to reach people where they are. It means that some of the international and bureaucratic impediments are sort of relieved. And it also means that people in the Nuba Mountains are able to get much more out of the humanitarian aid that's coming to them. Now, there are difficulties now with doing so because it's quite difficult to move aid from South Sudan into Sudan, but also because the aid budget in general has contracted. But, the people in the Nuba Mountains who have been, some of whom, the younger generations, people in the Nuba Mountains don't really have a sense of belonging in the same way to Sudan as a nation, as people outside of that area do. So in many ways, if this war also continues and we're not able to heal some of these rifts between some of these open conflict zones and the central state, we're also looking at the fragmentation of the country. But I think it's also worthwhile to say that we have also seen this war arrive at the Nuba Mountains. It hasn't been spared just because it's not, in many ways sort of seen as part of the rest of the country. We have seen just in the past week, the Sudanese armed forces bombing civilian targets in the Nuba Mountain areas. And that's something that will need to be, looked at in terms of transitional justice and redress. I think when we look at the political picture, what's interesting is that the SPLM and under the leadership of Abdullahi al-Hilo has been able to shift his political allegiances between the belligerents in order to serve his purposes. And his purposes initially were to ensure that the areas under his command, which were disparate, they were not connected, would become a contiguous territory. And so he has, sort of helped out, shall we say, it's not necessarily an alliance, the Sudanese armed forces in one time, and then the rapid support forces another, and then back with the Sudanese armed forces. And this back and forth and this unpredictability from the outside is actually very tactically, rather very strategically done in order to ensure that he grew the territory under his command, which he now has done. What this also means, though, is that the humanitarian needs will be greater in that area with more people, etc. So I think what the question alludes to is that we need a lot more focus on what's going on in South Kordofan and in the Nuba Mountains in particular. And I think even though it has been a semi-autonomous region, it should absolutely be included in conversations around what's happening in the rest of the country as we try and highlight what is going on throughout this war and what possible trajectories there could be for the different areas.
Thank you, Kholood. I want to take two questions that are somewhat related. So one question is asking about what foreign policy actions the U.S. government should take. And this is the first question in the queue. And the last one is, what should those of us in D.C. be doing to pressure the U.S. government? So I see these as connected, right? So what kind of organizing should we be doing, but what should we be organizing for is kind of the first question. Easy questions. Yeah.
I'm happy to take this, but I'm going to let May and Abdullahi answer first, and then I can add my 2 cents later.
May?
Well,
Yeah.
I feel like I have a very uninformed take on this, but in part, the conflict has been ongoing and seems to have no end, in part because there's no clear answer. That it's just unclear what makes the most sense. I think a lot of people in the Sudanese diaspora, I think a lot of people who look at the Horn of Africa, who study the Horn of Africa and spotlight it, are really worried about the humanitarian situation and are really hoping for ways in which aid can be better coordinated there. Because as of now, it just seems that a lot of it is this, I saw on Twitter the other day, like, can we Venmo or not Venmo? Can we PayPal our way out of, or GoFundMe out of a famine? And that's definitely not the case. And so some kind of coordinated effort is necessary, but it's unclear how best to address the situation. Whether it makes sense to target the elites in the RSF and SAF and, pressure them by, dangling inducements for them to come to the negotiating table, or threatening them with other types of constraints. Whether it's, I don't know. This is, I guess, the $1 million question. I'm sure others have a better.
Yeah, I mean, let me profile some. Number one, I think, like I said, there are 3 ways within which, pathways through which this can be resolved, and, all of them involve too many things. But I think in terms of the negotiations, I think the US government could do well in preventing some of these actors to do forum shopping, because we've got so many forums, and these lads, most of them are men. They know what to do. They know which forum to go to. They know which forum would give them a favorable hearing. I think now, with the appointment of the special envoy, it's the right time to ensure that all these processes are coordinated. IGAD has its own process. African Union has got its high-level panel. We have the special envoy that the United States has. UN Secretary General has his own personal envoy. I think it's about time, at the level of cessation of hostilities or ending of the conflict, these processes needs to be coordinated to prevent the disincentive or the incentive of the actors going around shopping for which forum suits them very well. I think the second part that the United States can do, I think we've known it very clearly now that under this administration, unless it's a strategic communications problem, it really, this administration doesn't act, right? If you compare the previous administration and this administration came in with fanfare. Africa would be at the center. Nothing can be done without Africa. And the only time they tend to visit African countries is largely, during the Ukraine crisis, because they were afraid that some of the African countries could not side with Ukraine. And I think, apart from the senior level individual who are from the administration that has visited, is only Linda Thomas Greenfield, who went to Chad, not Sudan, right? We've not seen the UN, US, the Secretary General making visits. I think a visit to Port Sudan, a visit to even rank in South Sudan will demonstrate that this administration really, not as a photo op opportunity, because this has gone on for far too long, I think as a serious step. I've got 2 more. One is really the United States has outsourced some of its policy responsibilities in the region, especially in the Horn, to the Gulf countries for obvious reasons, because they deem to see Gulf countries as as their partners in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. I think that has terribly eroded their legitimacy. That has terribly incentivized these actors, and these actors are just malign actors in the region now. Like if you look across the region, starting with Tunisia, Egypt, and now Sudan, these countries have worked assiduously to really prevent any emergence of popular, democratically elected administrations across these countries. And the notion that the United States, this is their credible actor, I think the United States needs to move. They say they speak to them in private. I think to really make that public that you cannot be a partner and continue, again, doing that. Finally, as part of accountability, in December, the United States Secretary of State announced, atrocity determination, what was going on in Darfur. I think this is about time the United States put some teeth, put some policy actions behind the atrocity determination. Short of that, it will just be another atrocity determination, a la the one that happened in Ethiopia, that is not followed through with anything. And all the while, like there is not even adequate evidence collections for some of the egregious human rights and humanitarian violations that are taking place. Even if some of these issues end up in court, it's not because of anything that they might or could be dismissed. It's because there hasn't been adequate evidence collection, storage, and all that needs to happen. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps where you left off also speaks to the next question. And the next question is about kind of protecting civilian governments in the future, right? How can any further attempts at a civilian government be protected from belligerent actors left over? And Kholood, you've already talked about accountability and transitional justice. And Abdullahi, you've just ended by talking about the need to gather evidence, right, as part of this, and the fact-finding and the human rights fact-finding as part of this. So I just wonder, does anyone else have anything else they want to add to that question? Again, this question of how to protect a civilian government from belligerent actors.
Sure, Fida. I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because what we've seen in Sudan's history is that you have had not only successive military governments, but they've lasted longer and longer and longer. First one 9 years, second one 16 years, and then this one, last one, 29, almost 30 years. And what this means is that the military has figured out ways to stay in power for longer. It has figured out ways, for example, to co-opt civilian entities, to incentivize them to act against each other, to disconnect from their constituencies. It has figured out ways to game the economic model in its favor, taking over a large part of the economy, and effectively being able to pull every lever of state, bureaucratic or otherwise, in the formal and the informal sectors, in other words, to protect itself. And we saw how difficult it was to even comprehend how deep the tentacles of the military state in Sudan ran during the transitional period, which of course was not long enough anyway to really do justice to that. But I think the first thing we have to agree on is that the issue in Sudan is that the state has become extremely militarized. And even though that might seem quite obvious to a lot of us, there are a lot of people who believe that because of the threat of the rapid support forces, for example, to everything they know and hold dear in Sudan, that the Sudanese armed forces must to some degree be expected to, or sort of be supported to, protect, quote unquote, the state of Sudan and its citizens, something the military has really never done. There's no historical precedent for Sudanese armed forces protecting civilians anywhere. In fact, all of the Sudanese armed forces campaigns since its inception have always been against its own people. So we need to sort of, I think, be very clear-eyed about how we read our own history and how we sort of check out the fault lines of how we got to where we are. You know, people will say, for example, that civilian parties in the 60s and the 80s handed over power to the military when they couldn't agree amongst themselves, and therefore it is these civilians, for example, that are the problem. But without looking at the sort of the militarized ecosystem that the Sudanese armed forces and its adjunct, entities like the RSF have created and recreated over time, that serve to put civilians in the position where if they can't agree with each other, they will naturally go towards somebody, with a gun and say, sort this out for us. That's a tendency that we need to break. That, for me, is not so much a problem with the civilians. It is a problem with the ecosystem and the climate that forces them to make these kinds of decisions. We've also seen that the militarized state pulls civilians in one direction or the other, not only so they can't come together, but also because military actors have recognized that they can't rule alone. They have to have civilian constituents in order to be able to stay in place. And Bashir was very, very good through the Islamists at creating constituencies. In fact, I would say the Islamists are probably the best at creating constituencies by using customary and local kind of political, small p political engagements to really build a very robust constituency. We need to look at how we untangle all of those threads. This is not going to be a one and done. I don't think we're going to be able to fit all of these things into a political agreement at the end of this conflict and say we can now demilitarize the state. It needs to be at every single phase of this war, but also looking at a much, much longer term time frame for doing that.
Thank you very much, Kholood. And we're at time, so I want to thank you all again. Kholood, May, and Abdullahi, thank you very much for making the time to speak with us today, and Lara for facilitating for us. And I mean, it's a very sobering account, and like all of you, we are hoping and wishing for an end to the violence. And many of the questions that were left that we didn't get to, kind of thinking about what kind of future we can imagine. And thank you for all your efforts. And sure,
very quickly, there are people who are already doing this. There are people who are trying to imagine a different Sudan. There are people who are trying to weave together back the social fabric. They're on the ground. They're usually volunteers. They're definitely the people who've come out of the revolution. And this war is a counter-revolutionary war. It's trying to kill that revolution. And so far, it's been unsuccessful in doing so. So I know we've spoken about the doom and gloom and how complicated this is, but just want to stress at the end that absolutely there are people and organizations and organizing that is taking place as we speak that is holding down the fort.
Thank you very much for that, Kholood. And that's a very good place for us to wrap up. Thanks to all who participated in the audience, and be well, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Thanks.